Well, good morning and good afternoon, POD. Um, I think I was the lucky recipient of stomach flu. Stomach flu has been going around my house. My wife had it last week. My youngest son had it this week. And apparently, I am the lucky recipient of it today. So, what we got today is a handful of notes. Nothing too strenuous. We'll talk about some things leading up to the Declaration of Independence. There'll be a short homework, and then you have your projects, your paper to work on. That's due on Friday. So let's start with the Second Continental Congress. So the last time we talked in class, we talked about the United States was a group of British colonies. The British and the French fought in the French and Indian War. The British won the French and Indian War, and then they decided to make the Americans pay for the war. Even though the American people didn't really get any benefit from the war, they still thought that it would be a good idea if the United States paid for the war. So that's kind of where we left off. When we left off, we talked about the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, no taxation without representation, and the last thing that we talked about on last week was the First Continental Congress. Well, the First Continental Congress, they just kind of met together, and like most meetings when you first start out, it's kind of just a complaint session. It's like, oh, the king's doing this, blah, blah, blah. And that's kind of the way that goes. The Second Continental Congress was a little bit more productive. They started in 1775, May 19th. So some of the things they did in the Second Continental Congress is it became apparent that the United States colonies and the British crown were going to have to fight a battle. And in that battle, they needed a guy who they could count on to be their general. So there's two choices for the general. There was John Hancock and there's George Washington. John Hancock was the leader of the Massachusetts militia. He was the governor of Massachusetts at one time. He's been through a whole bunch of things, and he had a lot of support. The other one was George Washington. George Washington was a former lieutenant, maybe he rose all the way up to captain, in the British Army, and then he retired. He fought during the French and Indian War. He was the commander's right-hand man during the French and Indian War, so he had a lot of experience also leading the military. So the Second Continental Congress got together, and they decided that George Washington would be the guy to lead them. The other thing that was decided in the Second Continental Congress was they got together and appointed 5 different men to write down a declaration stating the colony's intent and reasons for independence. So this is where the Declaration of Independence first gets its start. They start talking about it. They assign these 5 guys to sit down and start coming up with reasons why the colonies would like independence from the crown. In June, so they first started in May of 75. In June of 75, the 56 delegates, so that was representatives from each state, and they all met and debated. Even though there was 56 not 56 relatives, 56 delegates, there was only 1 vote per colony. So there was 13 votes cast about whether or not to declare independence, what they should do, how they should do it, what should the wording be. They debated and deliberated and talked for over a year. So it wasn't like it was a rash decision. They didn't just jump right in. They actually thought about it. They took their time and went through the process of deciding what's the best option for them. And then in January of 1776, a guy by the name of Thomas Paine, and we'll talk a little bit about Thomas Paine after a while. We'll talk about a little bit more as we progress in here. But Thomas Paine wrote a Sorry about that. Thomas Paine wrote a book or a pamphlet called Common Sense, and explained why there should be independence to the public. So it was one of those deals where, as these guys got together and they met, they talked about why they felt that the colony should declare independence. But they were smart about it because they also got the public on their side. So it's one of those deals where if you think about like some of the things that Congress does or whatever, and they talk about this, and before they kind of know people's wants, needs, reactions, before they take into account everything that might happen, they make decisions and try and sell it later. What the Founding Fathers did is they started to try and convince the people before they actually made the move for independence. So there was a couple of things that happened during the Second Continental Congress. They drafted the Declaration of Independence, and as they went through and they wrote it, it was approved on July 2nd. So these 5 guys that they tasked to write the Declaration of Independence, they sat down, they wrote it, they included all the pretty words, they went through, listed all their grievances, and basically it was a really long breakup letter. It's like, you've been doing this and this and this, and we're tired of it, and I don't want to see you anymore. I want to see new people. I want to have my independence. So that was all approved on July 2nd. On the 4th of July, the Declaration that was written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, was signed by John Hancock. He was the first person to sign it, and he signed it the largest. The reason that John Hancock signed it the largest is he was deemed a criminal of the state by the king, and so he wanted to make sure that the King of England knew that he signed it and approved of it. Taking a shot at the King of England. What the Declaration of Independence did ultimately was sever all the ties with Great Britain and kicked off the Revolutionary War. Now, the Revolutionary War was going on at the time, but at that time they were fighting, and in the style in which they were fighting, it was smaller battles. There was a couple bigger battles, but they were kind of like, the British didn't want to engage in full-scale warfare yet, because once you do that, then the chances of somebody coming back and being your friend or being your protectorate isn't very likely. So, but after the Declaration of Independence, that was the official divorce from England, and the battles intensified. So a little bit about the Declaration of Independence. So as they were tasked to write it, like I said, it was Thomas Jefferson gets the main credit for it, but there was a few others that helped him. But as they were going through and writing this Declaration of Independence, they didn't just start writing down a list of complaints. They understood what they were ultimately doing. They were filing divorce papers. Again, it's one of those deals where, and now you have to list all the reasons why you don't want to be married to the King of England anymore. And as you go through it, you have to hit on all the high points. And not only that you, as a wealthy plantation owner in Virginia, are experiencing, but also all the regular people around. So as you start spreading this information out and you start talking to people about this and trying to get them on your side that this is a good idea, if you just, have a whole bunch of problems that only rich people are dealing with at that time, you're probably not going to get a lot of support. So they made sure that as they went through it, the Declaration of Independence, they were very deliberate with their wording. They made sure that it was very black and white why the colonists wanted to separate. It wasn't like, well, you guys are kind of mean to me, and I'm not having any fun anymore, and stuff like that. It was a long list of things like, you guys have done this, and you guys have done this, and you guys have done this. So the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence lays down the philosophy behind the decision. One of the unique things that they wrote into the Declaration of Independence, and one of the things we talked about last year in the U.S. history, but since the founding of the country, this line right here, all men are created equal, and all men are equal. They excluded slaves and slavery from from that thought process. So as this country was founded, and as this Declaration was written, this will be a cause of tension for years to come. The other thing they put in there was the government was supposed to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which they guaranteed as a fundamental right for all people. So that means that the government is in charge of making sure that people have the opportunity to pursue the things that they want to pursue, that they are free to pursue those things, and they don't have any undue stresses put on their life. Because the British government did not ensure the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for the American colonies used that as a justification to rise up and overthrow their government. And because of these life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, they are justified in their actions. And they're not doing it just because you said something mean and now I don't like you. It's one of those deals where they use this as a justification, like you're because of the taxation that you've imposed on us, because of this and this and this, all these things that you've been doing to us, we are no longer to pursue happiness. We are no longer free people, and you are hampering the ability for us to live our life. So, the Declaration of Independence is formed on three basic principles. The first one is natural rights. Natural rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was one of the big calling cards for starting the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence. Now, popular sovereignty. We talked a lot about popular sovereignty last year during the Civil War. That was a political excuse to not really make a decision on slavery as the country was getting closer and closer to civil war. But popular sovereignty, again, is people have the right to decide. So people get to vote, and they choose the path that they want to go. And that goes back to when we talked yesterday or last week about no taxation without representation. So one of the things that, as the Stamp Act and the T-Tax and some of these other things were coming into play for the colonies, they wanted to have some representation over in England in the Parliament, so they could decide how much are they going to get taxed, what exactly are the parameters of these things, and the British government denied them that access. So that was popular sovereignty. And then order. So again, the importance of stability. Overthrowing a government is only the last resort. So it wasn't that they wanted to overthrow the government to overthrow the government. The biggest thing they wanted to do is they wanted to overthrow the government currently because of the first two pieces. So because they didn't have the pursuit of happiness and because they didn't have a say in the way they were governed, they were overthrowing the government that they were currently functioning under only as a last resort. They didn't want to incur any more debt. They didn't want to pay any more taxes. They wanted to be able to do the things that they felt necessary to pursue their happiness. And so they put this last part in there, the order piece in there, to make sure that the people in the United States, more than actually the King of England, knew that, hey, this wasn't going to be a every time we don't agree with something type of situation, we're going to start a revolution. This is more of a specific instance where these things are happening to us and it's become untenable, and so we are going to fight for these basic rights. And the last one we have for today, there was also a list of grievances that they had for improper actions by the king. So we talked about last week about how the English government put stiff penalties on Massachusetts after the Boston Tea Party, about how then they limited the amount of access and power that the colonial government had in Massachusetts, and they were starting to do that in other places. And basically, they were disallowing the right for the colonists to self-govern. Again, no taxation without representation. That was a big one for the colonists. The other thing that happened is every time that there was a fight, French and Indian War being the latest large fight, but anytime there was a minor skirmish, they had to try and assemble an army or assemble a militia on a moment's notice because the colonies were not allowed to have a standing army. The other thing that happened is like George Washington. I told you he was in the French and Indian War and was the right hand man of the British officer who was the commander in charge of that operation. But the reason he stopped being in the British Army is because he had risen as high as he could in that place, and because he was a colonialist instead of a English citizen, he could rise no higher, and so that was also a point of contention. And we talked about quartering British soldiers. We talked about how they could just come to the house, knock on the door. You'd have to let them in. You'd have to feed them, and you'd have to provide them a place to sleep. So those are some of the list of grievances that the King of England, or that the colonists had with the King of England.